I didn't say a word when my son handed me that envelope. I just stood there in the kitchen. The same kitchen where I'd taught him to make scrambled eggs when he was 7. And I looked at the papers inside, and I nodded. That was the moment Natalie decided I was finished. She was standing behind him, arms crossed, watching my face the way you watch a game show contestant who just gave the wrong answer, waiting for me to crumble, waiting for the old man to cry or beg or make a scene she could tell her friends about later. I didn't give her that. I folded the papers back along their creases, slid them into the envelope, and set it on the counter next to my coffee mug. "I'll start packing tomorrow," I said. My son, his name is Glenn. He couldn't look at me. He was staring at the floor like the grout lines held some kind of answer. He's 51 years old, and he still does that. Still looks at the floor when he knows he's wrong. I recognized it from when he was a teenager. Back then, it meant he dented the car or failed a test. This time, it meant something I didn't have a word for yet. Let me back up. My name is not important for this story, but people who know me call me Harold. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years working for a commercial construction company in Columbus, Ohio. Not in the office, out in the field. Project management. I know how concrete sets, how steel frames go up, how a foundation either holds or it doesn't. That's the kind of man I am. Patient. Structural. I don't panic and I don't rush. My wife, Donna, passed 6 years ago. Breast cancer. It was the kind of loss that reorganizes everything inside you, like someone came in and moved all the furniture in the dark. You keep running into things for years afterward. But you learn the new layout eventually. After Donna died, Glenn and Natalie offered to have me move in with them. Their house was in Westerville. 4 bedrooms, 2-car garage. Good neighborhood. Glenn said it would be good for everyone. The kids could have their grandfather around. I could help with the yard. Maybe watch the boys some afternoons. He said it like we were all getting something out of it. And for a while, we were. What I didn't fully understand at the time was that the house Glenn and Natalie lived in wasn't theirs. It was mine. I bought it in 2009 when prices bottomed out, never sold it when I moved to a smaller place after Donna's diagnosis, and had been renting it to them at well below market rate for years. When I moved back in, we didn't formalize anything. I didn't change the deed or drop a lease agreement. It was family. You don't do paperwork with family. That was my mistake. My only real one. For the first year, things were fine. I kept to myself mostly. I had the basement room, which I'd finished out nice, my own bathroom, a sitting area, a workbench in the corner where I did woodworking in the evenings. I liked being around my grandsons, Marcus and Tyler. Marcus was 12, Tyler was 9. Good kids. A little loud the way boys are, but good. Natalie and I were civil, polite even. She ran the household with a kind of efficiency I respected. Dinner at 6:30, everyone at the table, no phones. She was organized. I'll give her that. But sometime in the second year, something shifted. It happened gradually, so gradually I almost missed it. It started with small things. The thermostat, I kept it at 68, which is where Donna always kept it. One day I came upstairs and it was set to 72. I turned it back. The next day it was 72 again. I mentioned it to Glenn and he gave me this look, not mean, just tired, and said Natalie got cold easily and could I just leave it. I left it. Then it was the garage. I had tools in the garage. Good tools, name brand, organized on a pegboard I'd built myself. One Saturday, I went out to get my circular saw, and half my tools were stacked in the corner under a tarp to make room for a treadmill Natalie had ordered. I moved them back. The treadmill ended up in the basement, 2 feet from my workbench. I told myself these were adjustments. Every household is friction. People work things out. Then her parents started visiting more. Natalie's mother and father, Patricia and Jean, were in their mid-70s and lived in Akron, about an hour north. Nice enough people the first few times I met them. Jean was mostly quiet. Patricia talked enough for both of them. They started coming down for weekends, then extended stays, a week here, 10 days there. The guest room was upstairs, right next to the boys' rooms. When Patricia and Jean visited, There was a particular energy in the house that felt like everyone was performing something. Natalie was lighter, more animated. She laughed more. I realized after a while that the house was more hers when they were there, and I was more of an inconvenience. I didn't say anything. I'm not a man who makes things harder than they need to be. But then came the conversation. I call it that, the conversation. Like it's a specific event, which it was. It was a Sunday afternoon in April. Glenn came down to my room and asked if we could talk. We sat at my workbench. He had his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, even though the coffee in it had gone cold 20 minutes before. I watched him turn the mug in circles while he talked. He said Natalie's parents were having a hard time in Akron. Jean had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. Patricia had high blood pressure and some mobility issues. They needed more help than they were getting, and they didn't want to move to a facility. He said Natalie wanted them to move in to have the guest room, maybe the sitting room next to it. I said, "That sounds like a lot for this house." He said, "Yeah, well, we were thinking you might be more comfortable somewhere else." I looked at him. He was still turning the mug. "Somewhere else," I said. "There's a really nice senior living community over in New Albany." We looked at it. It's got independent living apartments, a pool. They do social events. We thought you might actually enjoy it more than... He gestured vaguely. This. The thing about hearing something like that from your own child is that there's a moment right before you respond where everything goes very quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Pressurized quiet. Like the second before a pipe bursts. I said, "How long have you and Natalie been planning this?" He didn't answer fast enough. I had my answer. I want to be honest here. Part of me understood. His wife's parents needed care. He was caught between people he loved. That's a real thing. I'm not a man who pretends the world is simple. But there was another part of me. The part that remembered what address was on the deed to this house. The part that had spent 31 years making sure structures stayed standing. And that part went very still and very clear. I said, "Let me think about it." Glenn looked relieved. He shouldn't have. What happened over the next 3 weeks, nobody in that house knew about. I kept my routine. I came upstairs for meals. I helped Marcus with a school project about the water cycle. I watched the Indians game with Jean when he and Patricia were visiting that weekend. I smiled. I was present. I was, to all appearances, an old man slowly accepting the inevitable. Meanwhile, I called my attorney. His name is Frank Belletti. He's been handling my affairs since Donna and I bought our first house together in 1987. He knows me, and he knows how I operate. When I explained the situation, there was a long pause on the phone, and then he said, "Harold, you still have the deed." "I know," I said. "You understand what your options are." "Tell me anyway." He told me. I listened carefully. Then I asked him to start making calls. What Frank found took about a week. He found a buyer, a couple, both in their 40s, relocating from Pittsburgh for work, who were genuinely interested in the property. The house had appreciated significantly since 2009. We're talking about a number that would make most people's eyes go wide. Frank drew up the paperwork. We agreed on a closing date. I said nothing to Glenn, nothing to Natalie. The week before closing, Natalie's parents arrived with their SUV loaded with boxes. Natalie had clearly been preparing them for the move. She'd cleaned out to the guest room, pushed furniture around, bought one of those walk-in shower seats for the upstairs bathroom. Patricia was telling the boys which bedroom had been designated for her sewing. Jean sat in my usual chair in the living room and looked uncomfortable, which told me at least one of them had some sense of what was happening. That Friday evening, Natalie made a big dinner. Pot roast, which she knew was one of my favorites, and I recognized this as a gesture, an apology that didn't require an apology to be said out loud. She set the table nicely. Glenn opened a bottle of wine. It felt like a send-off, which I suppose it was. I ate. I thanked her for the meal. I told Marcus and Tyler I'd see them soon, which was true, just not in the way anyone expected. The next morning, I packed the rest of my things into my truck. Glenn helped me carry boxes, still not meeting my eyes. Natalie came out to the driveway and said she hoped I'd look at the New Albany place seriously, that they'd gone and toured it, that she thought I'd be surprised how much I liked it. She actually touched my arm when she said it. Soft. like she was comforting someone. I told her I'd been making some arrangements of my own. She nodded like she thought she understood what I meant. She didn't. I drove to Frank's office, signed the final documents, and handed over the keys to the new owners, Stephen and Claire, the couple from Pittsburgh. They were kind people. Claire had done her homework and had already researched the school district for their daughter. Stephen shook my hand with both of his and said they'd take good care of the place. I told him I was counting on it. I had arranged temporary housing for myself, a furnished apartment in Guyana, month to month, 10 minutes away. More than comfortable for what I needed. I spent that first weekend setting up my workbench area and watching the Reds game and sleeping better than I had in 2 years. There's something about a space that's entirely yours that you don't appreciate until you've gone without it. Now, I know what some people would ask at this point. Why didn't I just tell Glenn? Why not sit him down and say, I own this house. You can't move me out of my own property. Let's discuss this like adults. Here's the honest answer. I did consider it. For about 4 days, I turned it over, trying to find the version of that conversation that ended with my son actually hearing me. But Glenn has always taken Natalie's side in the end, not because he's a bad person. He's not. But because he needs the peace of his marriage more than he needs to be right. I've watched him make this calculation his entire adult life, and I knew down to my bones, that if I confronted him, Natalie would argue it differently, Glenn would defer, and I would end up exactly where I would have ended up anyway, just angrier and with a damaged relationship on top of it. This way, the house would simply be sold, legal, clean, no argument necessary. The closing had been on a Thursday. Frank told Stephen and Claire they could take possession beginning the following Monday. That gave Glenn and Natalie and Patricia and Jean 4 days before the new owners showed up. Frank's office sent the formal notification letter to the address on file. Certified mail. It arrived Saturday morning. I know this because Glenn called me Saturday afternoon, twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. The messages were short and increasingly panicked. The first one said, Dad, we got a letter, there must be some mistake. Call me back. The second one, about an hour later, said, Dad, please call me. Natalie is... Look, we need to talk. Call me. I called him back Sunday evening. He answered before the first ring had finished. His voice had that particular quality it gets when he's been cycling through emotions for hours and landed somewhere past angry and just into scared. He said, Dad, did you sell the house? I said, I did. Silence. Long enough that I checked my phone to see if the call had dropped. Then, you can't. That's, Dad, where are we supposed to go? I said, Glenn, you gave me an envelope with papers suggesting I leave. I left. I made my own arrangements, same as you made yours. That's not the same thing. You're right, I said. It's not, because the difference is I own the property. More silence. Natalie got on the phone. I expected anger, and she gave me something closer to shock, which surprised me a little. She said, Harold, you can't do this to us. We have children here. We have Jean and Patricia here. Where are they supposed to go? I said, Natalie, I've been asking myself the same question. Where was I supposed to go? The senior community in New Albany? I looked it up, by the way. It starts at $3,200 a month. She said, that's different. I said, is it? Because Patricia and Jean are in good health comparatively. There's a very well-regarded senior living facility in Akron. I found 2 actually, both highly rated. I can send you the links if you'd like. She went quiet. I could hear her breathing. Then Glenn came back on and said, Dad, please, can we talk about this in person? Can you come over? I said, Glenn, I'll always come over. That hasn't changed. But the conversation about the house is finished. The new owners take possession Monday. You have until then to start sorting out a plan. I heard Patricia's voice somewhere in the background asking what was happening. I heard Jean's voice, lower, saying her name once quietly, the way you calm somebody down. I felt a small pang for them, genuinely. None of that was their fault. But it also wasn't mine. I hung up. Monday came. Stephen and Claire arrived at 10 in the morning. Frank had, out of courtesy, informed Glenn and Natalie in the letter that the new owners would be taking possession at that time, which gave them the weekend to begin the process. They hadn't fully cleared out They were in the middle of it when Stephen and Claire pulled up in their moving truck. I wasn't there for that. I didn't need to be. What I know is what Glenn told me later, after the dust settled, in a conversation that was harder than any we'd had since Donna died. He and Natalie had scrambled over the weekend to find a rental. They found a house about 3 miles away, smaller, about $400 more per month than they'd been paying me. Patricia and Jean went back to Akron. The plan to move them in had been quietly abandoned. Glenn and I talked for a long time that evening, on the phone and then in person at a diner near his new place. There was a lot of silence. Some things said that couldn't be unsaid and didn't need to be. I told him I wasn't trying to punish him. I told him I understood he was trying to take care of his wife's family. I told him what I needed him to understand was that taking care of someone else's family doesn't mean discarding your own. He nodded. He didn't argue. He said, "I should have talked to you differently." That was enough for me. I'm not a man who needs a long apology. I just need to know somebody actually heard me. Natalie I didn't speak to for a while. That was her choice more than mine, and I respected it. About 2 months later, she called me. Short conversation. She said the boys missed me, and would I come to Marcus's baseball game on Saturday? I said I'd be there. I was. Standing at that chain-link fence, watching Marcus round second base and slide into third, Tyler climbing the fence next to me and yelling like his life depended on it. That was when I let the rest of it go. Not all at once, but enough. The money from the sale, by the way, went into a trust. Most of it will go to Marcus and Tyler eventually, when they're old enough to use it well. I kept enough to be comfortable, more than comfortable, truthfully, and enough to know that nobody will ever hand me an envelope and assume I have no options. What people don't understand about quiet men is that quietness isn't the same as weakness. I spent 3 decades making sure buildings didn't fall down. I know what a solid foundation looks like. I know the difference between something that needs to be torn out and rebuilt and something that just needs time and patience. My relationship with Glenn is the second kind. It needed patience. The house was always the first kind. Sometimes you have to clear the site before anything good can be built on it. I'm in a condo now, over in Dublin. 2 bedrooms, a small workshop off the garage where I keep my tools. Organized exactly how I like them. Nobody moving them for a treadmill. I walk to a coffee shop most mornings. I have a neighbor, a retired teacher named Evelyn, who grows tomatoes on her back patio and leaves them on my doorstep every August. It's a good life. Quiet. Structural. Mine. I still think about that Sunday afternoon sometimes. Glenn sitting at my workbench, turning that cold coffee mug in circles, unable to look at me. And me, just listening. Not because I had nothing to say. Because I'd already decided that words weren't the tool I needed. There's something I have come to understand about the way life actually works, not in a spiritual sense. Not anything borrowed from a book or a sermon, just from 64 years of watching how things play out. What you do to people tends to find its way back to you. Not as punishment, not as reward, just as consequence. Natalie assumed I was someone with no options because I was quiet and old and seemed easy to move around. That assumption was the seed of everything that came after. She planted it. The harvest was hers. But I want to be honest about my own part in it too. I made a mistake that I've turned over more times than I can count. I trusted the handshake where I should have had a document, not because I was naive. I've been in construction long enough to know that verbal agreements are worth the paper they're not printed on, but because I wanted to believe that family was different. That's a sentimental error, and sentiment is expensive. The moment I let the deed sit in a drawer while someone else made decisions about the walls around it, I handed over a kind of authority I hadn't meant to give. I don't blame myself for trusting my son, but I do take responsibility for not protecting what was mine clearly enough for there to be no confusion. That's the thing about real intelligence. Not the test-taking kind, but the kind that actually gets you through a life. It's knowing the difference between a problem that needs to be argued and a problem that needs to be solved. Glenn and Natalie were ready for an argument. They had their positions rehearsed. What they weren't ready for was me calling Frank Belletti on a Tuesday morning and asking him to run the comps on the property. And the part I'm most proud of, if I'm being honest, is that I didn't act out of anger. I was hurt, yes. I won't pretend I wasn't. But I waited until the hurt settled into something cooler and clearer before I made a single move. That's what I mean when I think about what it actually takes to get through something like this without losing yourself in it. It's not toughness in the way people usually mean it. Not loudness, not confrontation, not digging your heels in and refusing to bend. It's the ability to sit with something uncomfortable long enough to think it all the way through. To keep your head when someone is counting on you to lose it. I didn't sell that house to punish my son. I want to be clear about that. I sold it because it was mine to sell, because I had the legal right to do so, and because the alternative was giving up something I'd earned and built and paid for, and getting nothing in return except a room in a facility I didn't need or want. That's not a trade I was willing to make. No amount of keeping the peace is worth that. Glenn and I are okay now. Not perfect, but okay, which is a more honest thing to be. We have dinner every couple of weeks. I was at Marcus's last 3 baseball games. Tyler showed me a drawing he made in art class last month. Very proud of himself, and I hung it on my refrigerator and meant it. The house in Westerville has new people in it. They're raising a daughter there. Good foundation, solid bones. I know because I checked the inspection report before I sold it. Some habits you don't break. I'm in Dublin now, in a condo that is exactly the right size for one person who knows what he wants. My tools are on the pegboard where I put them. Nobody moves them. That's enough. More than enough.